Imagine standing before a mirror, watching your own humanity rip away piece by piece, knowing that the next person who looks into your eyes will freeze into solid, lifeless stone. This was the waking nightmare of a woman who did everything right, yet was condemned to a living hell. Long before the slithering vipers and the heavy curse of isolation, Medusa walked the marble halls of Athens not as a monster, but as a beacon of pure devotion. She had willingly surrendered her mortality, her future, and her freedom to become the high priestess of Athena, swearing a sacred vow of eternal purity. Within the towering stone sanctuary, she found a rare, quiet peace, safe from the predatory gazes of kings and mortals who viewed her beauty as a prize to be conquered. Yet, beneath her serene exterior lay a deep, creeping psychological dread. In ancient Greece, unmatched beauty was not a gift, it was a fatal magnet for divine ego. Medusa knew the volatile nature of the heavens. She understood that the gods did not see mortals as souls, but as playthings. Every night, as she lit the sacred altars, she battled a silent anxiety, praying her devotion would act as a shield against the cruel whims of Mount Olympus. Her mind was a fortress of discipline, desperately trying to outrun a destiny she never asked for. But divine eyes were already watching from the shadows. As the midnight oil burned low, a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the grand temple. The heavy scent of ozone and violent ocean tides choked the air, shattering the holy silence. Medusa froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as a towering, suffocating shadow stretched across the altar floor. The sea god had arrived, and the trap was about to spring. The air within the sanctuary turned to liquid ice as Poseidon stepped from the darkness. To the god of the sea, this was not merely an act of impulse. It was a calculated strike in a cosmic game of dominance. For eons, his rivalry with Athena had simmered, and defiling her most sacred crown jewel was the ultimate declaration of his untouchable power. He viewed Medusa not as a living soul, but as a beautiful canvas upon which he could paint his divine malice. Medusa's mind fractured into pure terror. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet her legs felt rooted to the marble floor, heavy as lead. She threw herself at the foot of Athena's towering statue, her fingers clawing at the cold stone, weeping silently as she offered her final, desperate prayers. The psychological horror of that night lay in the absolute stillness of the heavens. As the shadows closed in, enveloping her like a dark, crushing tide, Medusa realized the agonizing truth. The gods she had worshipped with absolute devotion were completely indifferent to her tears. Poseidon's presence was suffocating, a localized hurricane that stripped away her agency, her sanctity, and her light, leaving only the hollow echo of crashing waves against the temple walls. When the storm finally subsided, and the sea god vanished back into the mist, the sanctuary was left in ruins. Medusa lay broken on the fractured floor, staring blankly into the dark, her spirit shattered. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. As the morning sun broke through the cracked roof, a blinding, terrifying golden light began to descend from the clouds. Athena had finally arrived, but she did not come to heal. The descending light of Athena did not bring warmth, but a blinding, suffocating heat that scorched the very air of the ruined temple. Medusa looked up through her tears, expecting the comforting embrace of justice, only to meet an expression of absolute, unyielding stone. Athena's mind was caught in a bitter, prideful fury. A mortal high priestess had been compromised under her watch, a direct humiliation orchestrated by her greatest rival. To punish Poseidon was impossible. The fragile hierarchy of Mount Olympus could not survive a war between major deities. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim her narrative and project absolute authority, Athena chose to shift the blame. She looked down at the traumatized maiden and decided that the victim would become the scapegoat. The curse descended like a physical weight, ripping through Medusa's form in a wave of agonizing, psychological horror. Her silky tresses began to warp and twist, turning into a writhing, hissing nest of venomous serpents that tore at her sanity. Her smooth skin hardened, sealing her away from the touch of humanity forever. But the true depth of Athena's malice lay in the alteration of Medusa's eyes. The goddess decreed that henceforth, Her gaze would reflect the ultimate weight of desolation. Anyone who looked upon her face would be instantly trapped in a permanent tomb of solid stone. Stumbling backward, a wave of profound betrayal washing over her broken soul, Medusa caught a glimpse of her new, monstrous silhouette reflected in the polished bronze armor of the goddess. Horrified, she sprinted blindly out of the city, seeking the dark edges of the earth. Yet, as she fled into the wilderness, she heard a terrifying rumor whispering through the winds. Her curse had just caught the attention of the world's most ruthless kings. On the desolate, fog-shrouded island of Serpent, at the absolute bleeding edge of the world, Medusa sought a fragile sanctuary in the dark. She lived not as a hunter, but as a ghost, wrapping her scaled form in shadows to protect a world that had utterly abandoned her. Her inner life was a profound, agonizing paradox. She possessed a weapon of absolute lethality, yet her heart remained painfully, desperately human. Her greatest torment was the weaponization of her own gaze. She was condemned to a life where love, comfort, and simple companionship were entirely impossible. To look upon another living soul was to sentence them to an eternal, calcified silence. Her lair became a grotesque museum of unintended tragedies, stone statues of arrogant warriors and curious explorers frozen mid-stride, their eyes wide with permanent, horrified realization. Medusa wept for them, her tears falling onto the cold scales of the vipers that nested upon her head. She had accepted her exile, choosing to wither away in absolute isolation to ensure no more innocent blood was turned to granite. But the world of men would not let her rest. To the ambitious kings of Greece, her suffering was not a tragedy to be pitied. It was a legendary trophy to be collected, a prize that could grant a kingdom ultimate military dominance. She heard the distant, echoing clank of armor outside her cavern walls, a sound that usually meant another foolish soldier had come to die. But this time, the atmosphere felt entirely different. As she retreated deeper into the subterranean gloom, a sudden, blinding flash of light pierced her cavern. A figure stepped through the fog, but he carried weapons that did not belong to mortals. The gods themselves had returned to finish what they started. The figure standing at the cave's threshold was Perseus, a young warrior driven by desperate necessity and the crushing weight of a king's ultimatum. Yet, he was no independent hero. His mind was a battlefield of fear and determination, knowing he was merely a mortal pawn in a cosmic game. To survive, he had accepted the ultimate divine intervention. The gods had stacked the deck with absolute precision. On his feet gleamed the winged sandals of Hermes. Upon his head rested the dark helmet of Hades, rendering him completely invisible to the physical world. But his most lethal asset was a mirror-polished bronze shield, a parting gift from Athena, who was still fueled by an ancient, unyielding spite. The goddess of wisdom did not just want Medusa removed. She wanted her erased from existence using the very beauty that had caused her downfall. Inside the suffocating darkness, Medusa felt the shift in the air. The heavy, rhythmic beating of wings echoed through the stone chambers, yet her heightened senses could detect no physical form. For centuries, she had successfully defended her isolation, but how could she fight an enemy she could not see? The psychological tension reached a fever pitch as the invisible intruder drew closer, the soft scraping of a blade echoing against the damp cavern walls. Medusa realized with a sinking heart that this was not a standard hunter seeking fame. This was a highly calculated execution arranged by the heavens. She retreated into the deepest recess of her sanctuary, her venomous serpents hissing in blind panic as the freezing presence of death closed in. Suddenly, a strange reflection gleamed on the wet stone floor. Perseus had stopped just yards away, adjusting his shield to track her movements. He raised his blade, completely shielded from her lethal gaze, and prepared to strike the final, decisive blow. The blade fell in the absolute silence of the cavern, severing the final thread of a tragic mortal existence. In that fleeting, final second, the reflection in the polished bronze shield captured a sight that history chose to forget, not a monster snarling in fury, but a broken woman welcoming the eternal peace of the dark. Her long, agonizing exile was finally over. Yet, the exploitation did not end with her final breath. Perseus claimed his prize, carrying the ultimate relic of desolation back to the heavens. Athena, completing her grand, unyielding narrative of absolute authority, fastened Medusa's frozen, screaming likeness onto her own battle armor, the Aegis. The very trauma inflicted upon an innocent priestess was transformed into a permanent weapon of terror, used by the goddess to strike fear into the hearts of her own enemies for all eternity. This is the true, haunting legacy of the myth. For millennia, the world accepted the story told by the victors, celebrating the triumph of a glorious hero over a hideous demon. But when the golden veneer of Mount Olympus is stripped away, we are left with a far darker truth. Medusa was never the architect of her own nightmare. She was a canvas upon which the powerful carved their pride, their lust, and their terrifying capacity for injustice. Her story is a profound, timeless warning about how history is written, reminding us that those branded as monsters are often merely the victims whose voices were stolen by the gods who wear crowns. As the shadows close on her tragic tale, we are left to look into our own collective reflection and ask a haunting question. When history demands a monster to shield the sins of the powerful, who will be the next to turn to stone?